The Line of Kings, a nighttime journey through the history of English royalty. Good evening. Take a deep breath and close your eyes. Imagine walking through an England of the past, a land divided by Saxon baronies, scattered villages, and roads marked by forgotten Roman footsteps. It's the year 1066, and tonight you're about to meet a man who changed the history of a kingdom forever, and who left this world in an unusual way. But that part we'll tell later. His name was William. In his youth, he was known as William the Bastard. Later, he would receive a more feared title, William the Conqueror. William wasn't born on English soil. He came from Normandy, a region in northern France. And like many men of power, he was born amidst doubts and disputes. But he carried something few possessed, an absolute conviction that the throne of England should be his. After King Edward the Confessor's death, in January of that same year, 3 men proclaimed themselves legitimate heirs to the English throne. Among them, William. And it was in October that the earth trembled beneath the hooves of heavy cavalry. William crossed the English Channel with a vast, disciplined, determined army. On the field of Hastings, he would face Harold Godwinson, the English king appointed by the Assembly. It's said that the battle lasted the entire day, that the grey sky watched in silence, and that England's fate was sealed by an arrow lodged in King Harold's eye. William had won. But conquering the land was just the beginning. Governing a people who didn't accept him would be another war. To consolidate his rule, William began what we know today as the Domesday Book, one of the most detailed records of lands, possessions, and serfs in the Middle Ages. It was about control, power, and also a portrait of a newly subjugated kingdom. But William wasn't invincible. During his years of reign, he faced rebellions, betrayals, and conspiracies. His rule was marked by firmness and a heavy hand, including a dark episode called the Harrying of the North, in which entire villages were burned and populations decimated as punishment for resisting Norman rule. The medicine of the time could do little. Serious injuries meant certain death. Simple diseases took weeks to end. Medical practices were based on balancing the bodily humours: blood, phlegm, black and yellow bile. Bloodletting was common, as were herbal infusions, prayers, and Latin incantations. William grew old, and also very fat. In his last years, his body became too big, too heavy for the throne itself. It's said that he died after falling from his horse during a military campaign in northern France in 1087. But the most unusual moment would come later. During the funeral, his body, so swollen, wouldn't fit in the hastily prepared stone sarcophagus, and when they tried to press him in, something strange happened. The body ruptured. A muffled sound, an unbearable odour. The first Norman king of England had departed, leaving the world with the same brutal force with which he had dominated it. And so ends the story of William the Conqueror. Or perhaps it only begins, when the day quietly bids farewell and the sky is painted with the bluish hues of dusk. We turn our thoughts to ancient times. Times when kings wore heavy crowns and carried the weight of a kingdom with every decision. Today, we journey to the late 11th and early 12th centuries, where Norman blood still flowed through the roots of the English throne. William II, the Red King. William II, the Red King, an impetuous monarch with a vivid temper like the flaming hair that earned him his nickname. His father, William the Conqueror, had left him a consolidated throne. But a throne, even so, is a lonely and dangerous place. William loved to hunt. The dense woods of the New Forest, created by his father, were his refuge, his private battleground against boredom. It was there, on an ordinary summer day in 1100, that fate set its ambush. An arrow, shot during the hunt, struck him in the chest. The official version speaks of an accident. But there's something dark about that silent clearing where the arrow found its mark. No man mourned his death, and his body was left where it fell, while his companions fled, perhaps in fear, perhaps in guilt. Henry I and the Lampreys. And then Henry I, William's brother, quick to seize the chaos, hastily crowned at Westminster Abbey, while the blood of his brother still stained the forest grass. Henry was shrewd. He enacted laws that softened the Norman rigours, but his passion, oh, his passion, was the table. Henry adored lampreys, slimy, strange fish that slithered through dark, muddy rivers. It was said that his death in 1135 was caused by an overdose of these creatures. Doctors of the time, not understanding how the body worked, viewed foods as forces that could unbalance the humours and the lamprey. Well, it was considered a delicacy for the bold. The anarchy and medieval medicine. Henry's death brought chaos. The succession was uncertain. His daughter, Matilda, was supposed to inherit the throne, but the nobles preferred her cousin, Stephen, a charismatic but weak man. Civil war erupted. A dark and confusing period known as the Anarchy. Lands were plundered, villages burned. England seemed to have regressed to the time of the Britons. Stephen reigned, but never with peace. And Matilda, the Empress, was never crowned. In this period, medicine was a fragile balance between faith and superstition. Doctors prescribed bloodletting for almost everything: fever, melancholy, even heartache. The belief was that the body possessed 4 humours, and an imbalance of any of them caused illness. For kings, treatments were accompanied by prayers, sacred relics, and amulets hung beneath their pillows. Imagine yourself in a dark stone room, with heavy curtains muffling the air. The ailing king rests on embroidered sheets, while the physician prepares the blade for the bloodletting. The blood flows, warm and thick, into a silver basin, and everyone waits. They wait for the illness, like the blood, to drain away. But the illness didn't always leave. Sometimes it stayed, and awaited the next monarch. And so ends this chapter of the Norman lineage, where an arrow charted the fate of one king, and a strange fish sealed that of another. Close your eyes, breathe deeply. Soon we'll return, with the next name, the next throne, and another death whispered through the mists of time. Chapter 3. Plantagenets and the Dance with Destiny. As night deepens, and the sounds of the modern world softly fade into the background, we turn our thoughts to even older times, times when England found itself governed by men of steel and pride, born under the emblem of the Plantagenet dynasty. Our path now leads us to Henry II, a king whose will was strong, and whose words, at times, proved fatal. Henry ascended to the throne in 1154, determined to restore order after the chaotic years of the anarchy. Intelligent, articulate, yet also impetuous, he sought to centralize power and limit the church's influence. To achieve this, he appointed a loyal ally, Thomas Becket, as Archbishop of Canterbury. But what was an alliance soon became a rivalry. Becket began to fiercely defend the church's interests and privileges, becoming an obstacle to the king. Frustrated, Henry is said to have uttered words that echoed beyond the stone walls of his castle. "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" And 4 knights heard, On the night of the 29th of December, 1170, in Canterbury Cathedral, Thomas Becket was murdered, kneeling in prayer. His death, an absolute sacrilege, reverberated throughout Europe. Henry, overcome with remorse, allowed himself to be publicly scourged by the monks of the cathedral, a gesture of penance or of theatre. After his death, Becket was canonized, and Henry, marked by the crime, continued his reign until 1189, more sombre, more silent. Richard the Lionheart. His successor was his son, Richard the Lionheart. Richard rarely set foot on English soil. His heart belonged to the Crusades, to the Holy Land, a warrior king, shaped by battles and blood. In his campaigns in the Middle East, he faced Saladin, organized sieges, and conquered fortresses, always leading his men. He was admired, feared, and absent. His death, however, did not come on a glorious battlefield, but rather during the siege of a small French castle, Chalus. An arrow struck him in the shoulder. The wound, treated crudely, became infected. He died slowly, in pain, not like an epic hero, but like a mortal man facing the fragility of the body. John Lackland. And then came John Lackland, a heavy name, for he was the youngest son, with no guaranteed inheritance, no glory in battle, and no love from his subjects. His reign was marked by defeats, taxes, and revolts. In 1215, forced by the English barons, John signed the Magna Carta, a document that limited royal power and established the first steps of constitutional monarchy. He didn't sign out of conviction, but out of desperation. John died of dysentery in 1216, a dirty, lonely death, perhaps fitting for a king so hated in life. Medicine in the Plantagenet era, medicine in the time of the Plantagenets, was still a fragile balance between faith and superstition. In abbeys, monks copied ancient manuscripts by Hippocrates and Galen, and prepared herbal remedies, mandrake for pain, lavender for nerves, garlic against blood diseases. But there was also a belief in miasmas, pestilential vapours, that, it was said, brought illnesses. The sick were treated with fumigations, amulets, and prayers. Many believed that diseases were God's punishment, and that the only true cure was penitence. Imagine, now, a stone cell within a monastery, a monk in a brown habit, grinding roots by candlelight. A sick person moans on his straw bed, while the walls exude dampness and centuries of murmured prayers. The sound of distant bells marks the hour of Vespers, and the story continues to unfold. Thus the Plantagenets danced with destiny between blood and parchments, between swords and crosses. Each king, a piece on history's chessboard, playing a game whose rules they barely understood. Now, breathe deeply. Let the weight of these stories rest softly upon you. Soon we'll move on to the next chapter, where the echoes of wars blossom with the arrival of the Black Death and the decline of chivalry. Chapter 4. Wars, Potions, and Vanished Princes. As the moon rises over the silent hills, and the world softly slows to the rhythm of night, the gates of time open once more. This time we cross the threshold of medieval England to enter an era of spears, pacts, and ghosts. An era where the sound of swords echoed across the fields of France, and castle corridors guarded secrets that never found rest. It is the beginning of the 100 Years' War. Edward III and the Black Prince. King Edward III reigned. Ambitious and convinced of his right to the French throne, he declared war in 1337. The conflict, however, would not be brief. It would not last a decade or two, but over a century, with pauses and resumptions involving 3 generations and leaving scars on both kingdoms. Edward was a monarch of firm presence, but also a strategist. His troops won at Crecy with the aid of a new weapon of war, the English longbow, and by his side was his son Edward of Woodstock, known in history simply as the Black Prince. It is said that this nickname came from the colour of his armour, perhaps also from his reputation. He was his father's mirror on the battlefield, determined, charismatic, fierce. He led troops at Poitiers, captured the King of France, and was celebrated as a living hero. But even heroes fall ill. The Black Prince contracted a mysterious illness, perhaps dysentery, perhaps lupus, and spent his last years weakened, far from the glories of youth. He died before his father in 1376 and never became king. His son, however, would ascend to the throne as Richard II. Richard II and the princes in the Tower. Richard was just a child when he inherited the kingdom. His reign was turbulent, marked by revolts, betrayals, and his own emotional collapse. He was deposed by Henry Bolingbroke, who became Henry IV. Richard died, imprisoned, perhaps murdered, but the unrest did not cease with his death. We fast forward to Edward IV, a strong, astute king and a central figure in the civil wars known as the Wars of the Roses. He died suddenly, leaving 2 young sons, Edward, aged 12, and Richard, aged 9. The boys were taken to the Tower of London under the guardianship of their uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. Soon, the uncle took the throne for himself, becoming Richard III. And the boys? They were never seen again. It is said that they vanished in the tower, and centuries later, bones were found beneath a staircase. Were they murdered? Did they survive in secret? The mystery of the princes in the tower remains, a constant whisper in the history of the English monarchy. Echoes of childish footsteps still seem to pace the stone chambers of the tower when the fog is thick. The Black Death. But before all this, another shadow loomed over England. A silent, invisible, and lethal shadow. The Black Death. It arrived in 1348, like a whisper from the sea. First in the ports, then in the villages, then everywhere. The disease was cruel. Intense fevers, darkened buboes, vomiting blood. And death came quickly sometimes in a single day. The medicine? Plague doctors wore long black robes, masks with beaks filled with aromatic herbs. It was thought that bad air miasmas carried death, that it was enough to purify the air with smoke, garlic, vinegar. Bloodletting was common, as was the use of precious stones in potions or the ingestion of liquid gold. Some prayed, others fled. Many simply awaited the end. But the plague, in its silence, taught a brutal truth. In the face of death, kings and peasants were equal. When the fog settled, half the population was gone, and England would never be the same. Now, breathe deeply. Feel the mists of time slowly dissipate. Let these memories rest gently upon you, like the kings and princes who have passed. The night is still young, and many chapters are yet to come. In the next, we will explore the fall of the Plantagenets, the throne taken by a Welshman Henry Tudor, and the tragic fate of the last Yorkists. Chapter 5. The Tudors and the Fury of Henry VIII. Night still rests upon the rooftops of old English towns, and as the mist silently enfolds the ancient stones, we move onward along the trail of history. It is the dawn of a new dynasty, the Tudors, Henry VII and Henry VIII. After decades of civil war, England found a new sovereign, In 1485, Henry VII emerged victorious at the Battle of Bosworth, ending the Wars of the Roses with the fall of Richard III, the last of the Plantagenets. Henry was cautious. He united the rival houses of York and Lancaster by marrying Elizabeth of York, and kept the kingdom balanced for a time. But it is his son who thunders through the centuries in English history, Henry VIII. Imagine a king, tall, imposing, charismatic, in the beginning, athletic and cultured. In the end, obese, paranoid, surrounded by betrayals, real and imagined. Henry VIII reigned for 38 years, and in that time 6 women shared his destiny. 6 queens, 6 stories intertwined in love, power and tragedy. Catherine of Aragon, his first wife, a Spanish princess. She had a daughter, Mary, but no son. Henry, obsessed with the succession, asked the Pope for an annulment of their marriage. The request was denied, and then came Anne Boleyn. Brilliant, provocative. Henry broke with the Catholic Church to marry her, initiating the English Reformation, but Anne also didn't give him a male heir. She was accused of adultery and incest, perhaps falsely, and executed by beheading. Jane Seymour, his third wife, gave birth to the much-desired son, Edward, but she died days after childbirth. Anne of Cleves, a political alliance that didn't please him. Henry deemed her disagreeable and annulled the marriage. Catherine Howard, young and impetuous, was condemned for adultery and also lost her head. Catherine Parr, his 6th and final wife, outlived the king and everything. The Tudor courts were filled with intrigue, mirrors and poisons. Every glance, every word could mean ascension or downfall. The Tower of London knew many restless souls in that time. The English Reformation and medicine, but the religious reform that Henry unleashed had effects that extended far beyond the altar. England's separation from the Roman Catholic Church opened the door to a new world of ideas. Monasteries were dissolved, and many medical manuscripts lost. But at the same time, universities began to explore the dissection of bodies, something previously forbidden under religious doctrine. For the first time, physicians could study real anatomy, not just the texts of Galen, written over 1,000 years earlier. In the 16th century, Oxford and Cambridge universities became centres of medical learning, though still deeply mystical in many aspects. Bloodletting, herbs, incantations, and now scalpels. The human body slowly began to be understood. Although pain was still treated with wine and prayer, it would still take centuries until the advent of anesthesia and safe surgery. The Protestant Reformation, initiated by Luther in Germany and propagated by Henry in his own political version, divided Europe, but also ignited the spark of doubt. And with doubt came experiment. And with experiment, science. When Henry died in 1547, he left a religiously fragmented country, but already on the path to modernity. His son, Edward VI, would reign only briefly. Then would come Mary I, Bloody Mary, with her pyres, and then Elizabeth I. But that is another story. Now, close your eyes. Let the echoes of beheadings fade. Let Henry's footsteps get lost in the corridors of Whitehall. Breathe deeply. The night is still long, and the story endless. Chapter 6. Iron Queens and the End of a Dynasty. A mist slowly drifts across the English fields. Church bells rest in silence, and in the cold halls of Tudor castles, new winds begin to blow. Winds that carry the presence of 2 queens. As different as light and darkness. Mary I, Bloody Mary. After the death of Edward VI, the young king who lived but briefly, the crown found its next owner, Mary I, daughter of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon. Mary was a woman marked by faith, by pain, and by the legacy of a humiliated mother. Raised in the Catholic tradition, she saw the throne as a sacred altar. Her mission? To restore England to the bosom of the Roman Church, and she did so with fire. During her short reign, over 280 Protestants were burned alive. The flames of the pyres cast shadows across the entire island. Names like Hugh Latimer and Thomas Cranmer, reformers, bishops, thinkers, became martyrs. For this, Mary went down in history as Bloody Mary. But fate is cruel to those who cling to the past. Mary died in 1558, childless, consumed by fevers and perhaps a tumour. And then a new star rose in the English sky. Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen. Elizabeth I, daughter of Anne Boleyn, who had been beheaded by Elizabeth's own father's command. The young princess, marked by scandal, by doubt of her legitimacy, took the throne under sceptical gazes. But she would reign for over 44 years, defying all who underestimated her. The Virgin Queen, Gloriana, the last of the Tudors. Her reign was a golden age, at least in legend, Shakespeare wrote. England defeated the fearsome Spanish Armada. Science began to insinuate itself. Cartographers charted new worlds. But in the shadows, there was suffering. Beauty was demanded, but it was a poison. Elizabeth, like many court ladies, used cosmetics made from white lead, a thick powder that whitened the skin and hid smallpox scars, a common disease at the time. But this same powder corroded the skin and poisoned the blood as the years passed. For lips and cheeks, cinnabar red was used, a pigment made from mercury, and for teeth which often fell out early, there were mixtures of vinegar, charcoal, and even honey with crushed stones. Tudor medicine and the end of an era. Medicine was still caught between superstition and experimentation. Doctors of the time recommended leeches, violent purgatives, and herbal baths that hurt more than they healed. Venereal diseases were treated with more mercury, applied as ointments or vapours, a cure as lethal as the illness. And yet, Elizabeth endured. She never married. She never named an heir. Her image precisely controlled became a myth. A woman who seemed made of steel, but steel, over time, also rusts. In her later years, Elizabeth avoided mirrors. Aged, ill, and tormented by nightmares, she died in 1603, sitting on a cushion on her chamber floor, refusing to go to bed, as if she feared never rising again. With her death, the Tudors came to an end, but the world she left behind would never be the same. The night remains calm. The echoes of Mary and Elizabeth still whisper between the cold walls of the cathedrals. The fires of the pyres have died down. The oil portraits still watch in silence. Close your eyes. Your breathing slows. Sleep approaches. In chapter 7, we will enter the era of the Stuarts' beheaded kings, civil wars, and the birth of new thought, where science begins to leave poisoned remedies behind. Sleep well. History, like time, never stops. Chapter 7. Headless Kings and the Age of Restoration. Night falls over a divided England. Cathedral bells toll deep notes. Amidst the cold stone and burgeoning ideas, a new era begins, marked by blood, silence, and nascent science. After the end of the Tudors and the death of Elizabeth I, a new branch takes the throne, the Stuarts. First, James I of Scotland, also becomes King of England, unifier of crowns, lover of literature, but this chapter belongs to his son, Charles I and the English Civil War. Charles I, a king of austere demeanour, firmly believed in the divine right of monarchs. For him, a king answered only to God, not to the people, but the people they were weary. Finances were in crisis, taxes abusive, and Parliament, an institution growing in power, began to resist. Thus began the English Civil War. On one side, the Royalists, loyal to the king. On the other, the Parliamentarians, led by a man of stern speech and fanatical belief, Oliver Cromwell. The war tore the land apart. Brothers fought against brothers, and in the end, the unthinkable happened. In 1649, the king was tried for treason. A court condemned Charles I to death. In the cold of January, he calmly ascended the scaffold, erected in front of the banqueting house in Whitehall. He wore 2 shirts, so he wouldn't shiver from the cold and appear afraid. The crowd fell silent. The axe fell. A king lost his head, literally, for the first time in English history. In his place, Oliver Cromwell seized power as Lord Protector of the Commonwealth. But his government, though free of crowns, was not light. He closed theatres, banned festivities, imposed Puritan morality, a state without a king, but also without laughter. The Restoration and Charles II. After Cromwell's death, the country cried out for a return. And so, in 1660, the heir to the monarchy returned. Charles II, son of the beheaded king. Charles II was the opposite of his father. Joyful, festive, surrounded by lovers and intellectuals. His reign marked the Restoration, an era of brilliance, science, and liberation. Under his court, the Royal Society was born, the embryo of modern science. Here, men like Robert Hooke and Isaac Newton met, exchanging mystical potions for formulas and lenses. But not everything was light. Charles II, fascinated by alchemy, also believed that metals could transmute. He ordered elixirs for longevity to be prepared. His royal chambers hid vials containing liquid silver, ground crystals, and mummy powder, literally taken from Egyptian sarcophagi. Early anatomy and the dawn of science. But as alchemy faded, another science came alive: anatomy. Bodies of executed criminals were delivered to physicians. With scalpels and candles, they performed the first public dissections. They learned about the heart, the liver, the lungs, and, with every cut, the veil of mysticism also broke. Human flesh ceased to be sacred and began to be understood. Yet there was something poetic in this paradox. While kings lost their heads over divine ideas, physicians opened skulls in search of the soul and found only flesh. Charles II would die in 1685 after a stroke and multiple treatments, bloodletting, cupping, vein extracts, and a potion made from ground human skulls. He was the last king to receive, in his lifetime, the full shadows of medieval medicine. Thus ends another chapter of the English monarchy. Heads rolled, alchemists sought gold in glass, and anatomists with their cold scalpels paved the way for a new era. Science was breathing. Chapter 8. The century of revolutions and the glory of Anne. The mist dissipates, and with it, time advances. We are now at the dawn of the 18th century. The sound of boots on wet cobblestones echoes through London. Carriages pass under still flickering gas lamps. And in the royal chambers, whispers speak of a new revolution, bloodless this time, but with eternal consequences. The glorious revolution. After the death of Charles II and the brief reign of his Catholic brother, James II, Parliament grew uneasy. The people feared the return of absolutism and the strength of the Roman religion. And so, in 1688, the Glorious Revolution occurred. There were no battles, no guillotines. It was a revolution of paper, politics, and cunning. James fled to France. In his place, his Protestant daughter, Mary II, and her husband, the Dutchman William of Orange, took the throne. They ruled together a delicate but stable arrangement. This transition sealed the monarchy's fate. Kings now reigned, but did not rule. Parliament took the reins of power, and for the first time, the people breathed the idea of constitutional sovereignty. Queen Anne and the birth of Great Britain. But history continues, always with its intertwined threads. In 1702, after William's death, Queen Anne, the last of the Stuarts, ascended to the throne. A discreet woman, of fragile health and a silent soul. She had 17 pregnancies, but no child survived. Her days were wrapped in veils of mourning and constant physical pain. Anne suffered from severe gout. Her feet swelled, her movements were limited. She spent her days among cushions and prayers. Even so, her reign would mark the emergence of a new power, the Kingdom of Great Britain, with the union of Scotland and England in 1707. Behind her quiet demeanour, Anne led the empire to expansion. Under her shadow, London grew in power, commerce, and medicine. 18th century medicine and inoculation. In the 18th century, treatments were still rudimentary, but they were beginning to tread a new path. Cupping glasses, made of heated glass and applied to the skin, sought to extract bad humours from the body. Leeches were placed on wrists and temples to relieve internal pressures, especially for headaches and melancholy. But there was something new in the air, something revolutionary: inoculation. Coming from the East, the practice consisted of introducing a small amount of pus from a smallpox patient into a healthy person. It seemed dangerous, and it was. But the results were surprising. Those artificially infected became mildly ill and survived. Compared to the deadly outbreaks, it was a blessing. Court physicians, still between wigs and silver vials, began to consider, what if it were possible to prevent diseases instead of just treating them? Thus, the empire that Anne helped to solidify also began to change the relationship between humanity and illness. When Anne died in 1714, childless, the Stuart dynasty ended, and a new one began, the Hanoverians, from Germany, with little familiarity with the English language, but with a clear mission: to maintain the Protestant throne and expand the empire. The world was entering the Enlightenment, but the halls still echoed with prayers, the beds still received cupping treatments, and the people still believed that blood, stars, and divine will influenced their health. Chapter 9: Queen Victoria and the Age of Wonders. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine a grey sky over London, crisscrossed by trails of smoke. Rivers of carriages and trams wind through wide avenues, where time moves faster, but hearts still feel as before. It is the 19th century, and on the throne rests a small woman with a firm expression and a heavy soul, Queen Victoria. Her reign would last 63 years, marking one of the deepest transformations in British history. Under her gaze, sometimes austere, sometimes melancholic, the empire would expand like never before, dominating territories on all continents and carrying with it not only flags, but also ideas and diseases. But make no mistake, this era doesn't belong only to imperial conquests. It also belongs to science, to progress, and to the slow replacement of superstitions by the certainties of observation, chemistry, and mechanics. The Victorian age was a time of wonders. Advancements in medicine. The streets of London, once dark and muddy, gained gas streetlights. The telegraph shrunk continents. And medical knowledge, once guarded in dark glass vials and whispered prayers, gained sharper scalpels and more attentive eyes. It was during this reign that anesthesia was introduced in surgeries. Imagine, before this, every cut, every extraction, every procedure was done with the patient awake, restrained by force and courage. But in 1846, at Massachusetts General Hospital in the United States, ether was used for the first time, and soon British surgeons began to adopt the method. For the first time in history, humans could be operated on without pain. It was as if the gods had offered man a veil of temporary oblivion, and thus bodies were opened, examined, stitched with precision, and, finally, compassion, personal loss, and public health. But not everything was triumph. At the heart of this empire, Victoria knew a pain that no advancement could cure: the loss of her beloved husband, Prince Albert, in 1861. He had been her advisor, her love, and, in a way, her moral compass. When Albert died of typhoid fever, a disease that spread through the dirty waters of cities, Victoria plunged into deep mourning. She wore black for the rest of her life. And so, for decades, the heart of the empire beat more subdued, more sadly. The people respected her, but also felt the weight of this silence. The throne, though powerful, seemed veiled. However, science continued its path. Cities grew, and with them, misery, rubbish, rats. London, immense and vibrant, had a monumental problem: sewage. For centuries, feces and wastewater flowed directly into the Thames, the same river that supplied the city. The stench was unbearable. In 1858, the summer became known as the Great Stink. The heat made the river boil in putrefaction. Parliamentarians fled sessions. And throughout the city, cholera silently killed. It was then that a man named Joseph Bazalgette came into play. As chief engineer, he designed and built a complex system of underground sewers, a monumental feat. Thanks to him, London ceased to be a plague trap, and medicine began to understand. The invisible enemy was in the water, not the air, and could be defeated with hygiene. The end of an era. Queen Victoria died in 1901. When she closed her eyes for the last time, the world had changed irreversibly. There were telegraphs, steam trains, cameras, and doctors who washed their hands before surgeries. The Victorian veil fell, and behind it, humanity peered into the future with curiosity, hope, and perhaps a little fear. Chapter 10. Wars, Abdications, and the End of an Era. Take a deep breath. Night rests over the fields of Europe like a veil of mist. The lights of the 19th century slowly fade, and, on the horizon, the 20th century begins to awaken, not with a whisper, but with the roar of modernity, of machines, and of something even more feared: war, world wars, and a changing monarchy. With the death of Queen Victoria in 1901, the throne passed to her son, Edward VII, a man already mature, with refined tastes and a more sociable personality than his mother's. His reign, though brief, marked the transition to a monarchy more open to the world and to change. But time was short. With the arrival of George V, Edward VII's son, the monarchy faced the shock of an unprecedented war. The First World War transformed fields into trenches and bodies into shadows. The royal family's German name, Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, was exchanged for something more palatable to British pride. Thus was born the House of Windsor. Between bombs and poisonous gases, medicine advanced, forced by urgency. The first large war hospitals emerged, where plastic surgery began to take shape to restore mutilated faces, and where psychological trauma, previously ignored, began to be recognized as shell shock. The world was changing, and so rapidly that not everyone was prepared to keep pace. Abdication and a wartime king. In 1936, King Edward VIII, George V's eldest son, ascended to the throne. But not for long. He abdicated a few months later for love. Enamored with the divorced American Wallis Simpson, Edward faced resistance from the church, society, and the government itself. In a gesture that would shock the world, he renounced the crown, stating he could not reign without the woman I love. And so, his brother, George VI, entered the scene, a shy man with a hesitant speech, who was not born to be king but would become a symbol of courage in times of darkness. During the Second World War, George VI remained in London, alongside his people, even as German bombs fell on the city. His figure, marked by his stutter, immortalized in films, and stories became a beacon of dignity. Penicillin and a new medical age. And it was under his reign that medicine took a gigantic leap. In 1928, Alexander Fleming had accidentally discovered a fungus capable of killing bacteria, penicillin. But it was during the Second World War that this antibiotic was produced on a large scale, saving thousands of soldiers and, later, millions of civilians. Now, diseases that once killed silently, like pneumonia or syphilis, could be controlled. It was as if death itself, hitherto relentless, began to retreat. Elizabeth II and the modern world. In 1952, with the death of George VI, his daughter ascended to the throne. Elizabeth II, a young queen who would reign for 7 decades. Under her watchful eye, the world would experience dizzying changes, the decline of the empire, the Cold War, the Beatles, the internet. She would become a symbol of continuity in times of disruption. And even amidst family scandals, political crises, and cultural revolutions, she would remain there impassive, firm, almost eternal. Medicine, by now, was already walking with its feet firmly in the future. The 20th century would see the emergence of modern vaccines, organ transplants, MRI scans, and a growing understanding of the human mind. Psychiatry and psychology, once viewed with suspicion, would become respected sciences capable of healing invisible wounds. The end of Elizabeth II's era in 2022 marked more than just the end of a reign. It was the end of a world and the beginning of a new one. The United Kingdom, now multicultural, digital, complex, still bears the marks of these centuries of blood, gold, faith, and science. But the throne, it remains. Empty for an instant, and then filled again. Close your eyes. Time, so constant and so relentless, advances like a silent river, carving its path through the stones of history, and upon its banks still stands, even today, the British throne. A chair adorned with symbols of power, yes, but also a seat shaped by invisible pressures, the weight of tradition, the burden of duty, the gaze of millions. However much it's painted with gold, a crown is also made of iron, and it weighs heavy. From the shouts at the Battle of Hastings to the solemn whispers at Elizabeth II's funeral. Kings and queens have passed, like shadows cast upon ancient walls. Some arrived young, others already bent by time. Some reigned briefly, others for almost a century. But all without exception had to yield to time, to death, to memory. The evolution of medicine. Throughout each reign, medicine also progressed, slow and hesitant at first, with prayers and potions, with blood and superstitions. There were centuries when it was believed that the king's touch could cure scrofula, an idea that mixed faith and science in a symbolic gesture of almost divine power. Then came the monks with their herb gardens, the surgeons with their rudimentary saws, the alchemists with glass vials. Then came the anatomists, the biologists, the pharmacists. The vaccine arrived, the precise scalpel, the antibiotic that saved multitudes, and finally, the intelligence of machines, helping to predict, diagnose, intervene. From every royal death by infection, by wound, by childbirth, or by old age medicine, learned something. The illness of kings often became the impetus for new discoveries. The enduring monarchy, and even with the advance of republics, computers, satellites, the monarchy persists. Why? Perhaps because it connects us to the past. A thin, golden, ceremonial thread that links the child born yesterday to a lineage spanning centuries. A reminder that there is continuity even in change. And as we look back at the names, the deeds, the tragedies, and the miracles, something is revealed. Every king and every queen was first and foremost a mortal body, inhabited by dreams, pains, ambitions, and fears. And like all of us, they passed on. The crown endures, but those who wear it pass on. The throne survives, but time never stops. And so, now that our vigil has ended, breathe. Let the ancient names rest at the back of your mind, like fallen leaves on a quiet lake. Let the sound of swords, coronations, and bells dissolve. Because everything passes, even kings, and in this final silence, may you find rest. Good night.